Hello everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Bray, and I'm beaming in from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, or a part of the world that you may know of as Sydney. Today I'm presenting a paper entitled Weight Stigma Towards a Corpus-Informed Linguistic Framework for Critical Discourse Analysis. And just as a small content warning, this article includes examples of confronting language related to people living with obesity, and it's present both in the slides and in the audio throughout the duration, so please do bear that in mind as we move through the presentation. So just to orient us to the talk today, I'll firstly establish the need that we identified for a framework for analysing weight stigma in language. I will introduce the framework that we've developed. I'll present a case study of this framework as it applies to the Australian obesity corpus. And finally, I'll discuss the usability of the framework for CADAAD analyses more generally. So our awareness of the need for such a framework came about when reviewing the existing literature. This literature included three main kinds of sources. Firstly, there are a set of media guidelines which basically provide media professionals with recommendations about how these issues should be reported on. They tended to focus on broad categories of language practice, drawing very helpfully from lived experience of those with obesity. Some provide select, highly salient examples of stigmatizing language, but of course we know that these same ideas can be expressed in other more subtle ways too, which the guidelines didn't attend to. There's also a body of non-linguistic research which largely focuses on frames, and frames tend to explain how negative attitudes about obesity shape news stories, but this isn't generally linked to specific language practices. And finally, there are a number of linguistic studies, mostly originating in the UK, which do explain how language practices draw on and contribute to stigmatizing societal discourses about obesity. But in large part, these are corpus-driven and therefore haven't yet systematically analysed all known types of weight stigma, and in particular those that have been identified in the media guidelines. So, of course, we see there's a need for a framework which comprehensively combines the full range of broader societal discourses around obesity with the fine-grained linguistic resources that are used to construct them. In developing the framework, we synthesized all stigmatizing language practices that were identified in the media guidelines, the linguistic research and the non-linguistic research, and we noticed that the language practices tended to map to a range of broader stigma types, sometimes frames, and these were also drawn from the literature. So that was the first step, to map the language practices against the types of stigma that we saw. We then collated all examples of lexis and grammatical structures that had been attested in academic studies or were mentioned in the media guidelines, and we organised these against the language practice that we felt they best exemplified. Now we acknowledge, of course, that a piece of language might perform several stigmatising functions, so the examples that we've included are intended to be demonstrative rather than exhaustive. We found that constructions of people with obesity were treated quite differently to constructions of obesity itself. So we designed two respective sub-frameworks. First, people with obesity, and second, obesity itself, and I'll briefly show you both. In total, we identified 34 separate language practices, which of course is too many to discuss in full today. So the tables I'm going to show you present a somewhat abridged version of the framework. The stigma types are all represented, but bear in mind that there are many more ways that they can be produced in language. So the first stigma type is constructing an obese other. We took quite a broad definition here, including language that constructed a person as different or distant from author or audience due to their weight. This includes language which positions the condition ahead of the individual, such as obese people, as you see there in the third cell. And I'll revisit this construction in a little bit more depth later on. Second stigma type is ascribing people with obesity with negative or stereotypical characteristics and behaviours. Others not included here include a lack of intelligence, neurosis, overeating, lack of self-control, and social deviance and criminal behaviour. Thirdly, dehumanizing involves minimizing the personhood of people with obesity. And another language practice that's relevant here is metonymic reference to a person via reference to a body part. This was quite common. For example, the term gut bucket was attested in one of the UK studies. Fourth stigma type is ridicule, or in some way positioning people with obesity as a source of amusement, either by commenting on their awkward manner of moving or through wordplay such as puns, alliteration, and rhyme. And then finally, excluding stigma generally excludes or marginalizes the perspectives and voices of people with lived experience, and this tends to be achieved through a reliance on expert opinion. Constructions of obesity itself were similarly negative but less diverse. For these, we simply mapped the examples against the more limited range of linguistic practices. So firstly, there are a number of negative metaphors that recurred across the literature. Physical exertion is another metaphor that isn't listed here. For example, economies being burdened by obesity was a common theme. Secondly, we have characterizing obesity as in some way a problem, focusing on medical aspects such as comorbidities and surgical remedies, focusing on associated costs. Characterizing weight loss as easy or simple is stigmatizing because living with obesity is therefore framed as a personal failure. And finally, emphasizing severity or prevalence of obesity, and this was particularly common in relation to a particular population, such as the UK as a whole, or in our corpus to Australians. Now, for this case study, we're applying the framework to a newly built corpus of Australian news articles about obesity called the Australian Obesity Corpus, or AOC. It was constructed to be parallel to a similar corpus in the UK to allow for comparison. It includes articles from 12 daily Australian newspapers, and they are the main metropolitan, state and territory-based newspapers, and our one national daily, The Australian. In order to be included, articles needed to contain at least one mention of the search terms obese or obesity, and this resulted in a total word count of close to 19 million and an article count of just over 26,000. So just jumping back to the framework quickly, I'm now going to present a brief explanation of the corpus-based methods that we developed to analyse these two language practices that are highlighted in red. And this is just to illustrate how one might use the framework in a corpus-based CDA study as opposed to a close reading or corpus-driven study, for example. So in analysing the first language practice of interest, making obesity central to identity, we chose to compare frequencies of dispreferred condition-first language with preferred person-first language. So condition-first language involves a human referent which is pre-modified by the term obese, whereas the preferred person-first construction involves a human referent which is post-modified by the term with obesity. So to analyse these respective forms, we first developed two search syntaxes which would retrieve instances of each, and importantly, the search syntaxes were designed to capture all relevant human nouns, in addition to people and person, as was analysed by Brooks and Baker, for example. Then we ran these searches across the whole corpus, returning all instances of human nouns pre- or post-modified by obesity or with obesity respectively. Now, as you can see, the condition first syntax returned 247 mentions per million words, while the person first syntax returned just 7 mentions per million words. This indicates that the dispreferred constructions vastly outnumber the preferred form. And the statistical analysis isn't presented here, but it also showed that the difference between the two is statistically significant, with a big effect size difference as well. Interestingly, this trend holds when the number of articles containing each of the forms is considered as well. As this figure shows, 3,208 texts contain condition first language and 106 contain person first language, though 47 of these use both forms, so only 1.8% of texts do not include the dispreferred form. Given that this recommendation is unanimous, particularly in the guidelines, this is a somewhat problematic finding. Moving now to the practice of labelling people with obesity with pejorative terms, our interest here was of pejorative labels that can apply to people, how often is this actually the case? So the lemmas shown in this table were independently identified by 2 RAs as potentially functioning as a pejorative weight-emphasizing label for a person. This process involved the RAs independently consulting a list of lemmas that were present in the corpus and making an impressionistic judgment call, and then tagging those lemmas that they thought could be used as a weight-stigmatizing label for a person. And then only the lemmas that were identified by both RAs were selected for further analysis. So with this short list of terms established, a qualitative analysis of a sample of 100 concordant lines of each was carried out to determine how often this was actually the case. The percentages of total instances which were identified as labelling people are shown there in the right-hand column of the table. So we see that the terms obese, overweight and fat are used to refer to a person in more than 10% of instances, and obese and overweight overwhelmingly so, with more than 90% of instances labelling people. Fat is somewhat more ambivalent, with 41% being applied to people, and this was largely due to usages of fat which referred to the substance, either in food or on the body, as well as a number of other metaphorical usages where non-human reference were described as fat as well. So because we couldn't rely on a form-based analysis for this term, we undertook an additional manual concordance analysis of all instances, which amounted to more than 8,000 instances, to determine actual levels of labelling usage. So for this phase of analysis, all instances were coded either as yes, i.e. involving pejorative labelling of a person, as no, or as in some way unclear. And the example that you have there refers to a fat nation, which involves an implicit labelling of a group of humans as fat, but not explicit, which was our criteria. So fat in fact showed greater ambivalence here than in the pilot, with 35.6% of instances relating to people, though if we include the unclear cases as well, the numbers are similar at approximately 40%. Nonetheless, fat is used to label people or bodies nearly 3,000 times in AOC, or 152 times per million words. Now you'll remember that the preferred person-first form was only attested 7 times per million words. So we begin to see quite a consistent pattern where stigmatizing language is produced with much higher frequency than the forms that people with obesity find respectful. Now, as mentioned in the abstract, we also want to briefly discuss the potential uses of the framework for CDA studies of weight-related texts more broadly. Firstly, while this is not our specific focus, we feel it's reasonable to assume that the framework can be used in manual qualitative CDA of obesity-related texts. Here, researchers could apply the framework and identify relevant resources in texts through close reading and analysis of texts. That is, it can then function as a topic-specific discourse analytical framework for the systematic analysis of weight stigma. Regarding corpus-linguistic CDA, we can distinguish potential uses in corpus-driven versus corpus-based CDA. In relevant corpus-driven studies that retrieve, for example, keywords or frequent words or n-grams, the framework could be of potential use as a lens for categorizing or interpreting results, for example, categorizing keywords or collocates according to the weight stigma types, rather than coming up with ad hoc categorizations. For corpus-based studies, specific corpus searches can be developed to retrieve particular resources in the framework, such as I've shown in my talk today. I demonstrated this for just two resources, namely person first versus condition first language, as well as the pejorative labels, but this could be done for the other resources as well, and indeed we're working on this at the moment. What I've presented today is work in progress and only a selection of the corpus linguistic analyses we're undertaking. So just to close, we feel that understanding the scope of the problem of weight stigma is crucial to being able to address it, and in particular to addressing the concerns laid out in the media guidelines. We believe this framework is an important contribution, and we certainly welcome further additions as analysis of other datasets is carried out and other stigma types and other language practices are identified. We hope that our work will inform others to develop corpus-informed frameworks for analysis of stigmatizing, excluding, or otherwise problematic language practices beyond the specific topic of weight stigma itself. Thank you again from the team and I, and here is the list of references should that be of interest. Thank you so much.